All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Leading the Charge. I'm your host, Brandis P. Bonos. Man, do I got a show coming up for you guys today. A really interesting, really fascinating, great show for you guys today. We're going to be talking about this Trump and Japan trade deal that actually took place 2 days ago. There's a lot to get into there. I'm going to be covering some geopolitics, global power dynamics, all that good stuff, stuff that we all love. Very fascinating, very interesting. We're going to talk about digital warfare, cloud computing, very technical, very interesting, very intricate stuff. So we got a full play today. I guess with that being said, we'll just go ahead and dive right into it. So, I'm sure most of you guys are already aware by now. The two greatest competitors to the United States on Earth are China and Russia. Now, it's slightly different in the case of Russia. The primary concern with Russia is that they are going to aggressively, through military force and military action, invade the neighboring countries, invade possibly Georgia, Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, and some of the countries in Central Asia that used to belong to the USSR. But economically speaking, technologically speaking, Russia doesn't really have any means of competing with the US. They are way behind in regards to semiconductor fabrication and design, in regards to EVs and bringing them to market, in regards to shares of global supply chains and how much of the world's global supply chains they actually control. They have a brain drain. There's corruption from the local level to the federal level. In Russia, the average lifespan for a man in Russia is 68 years old. People are dropping like flies. Disease, heart disease, liquor addiction, deaths of despair. I mean, they have all kinds of social problems, sociological problems, psychological problems. They are economically arrested. Not to mention, they have, I believe, the highest homicide rate out of any European country. So understand this, that Russia's main threat is the fact that they might invade their weaker neighbors, but that's really it. Now, the real concern for the United States is China. And if you look at any policy report, they will all tell you the exact same thing. You can look at RAND. You can look at CSIS. You can look at CNAS, the Center for New American Security. You can look at Brookings. All of them will tell you the same thing. I mean, they have pages dedicated to talking about the threat that China poses to the United States and the current global order. So that's a first order of concern for the State Department, for the Pentagon, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's China. And so countering China's ability to exert influence in different parts of the world, like Latin America, like the Middle East, like Africa, all these developing countries, is going to be incredibly important moving forward as we continue to develop through the digital age with semiconductors, with electronic vehicles, okay, with AI, all of that, pharmaceuticals, as those continue to improve. It is going to be incredibly important to challenge China's ability to dominate the entire earth, to dominate the countries that it borders, to dominate Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And here's the interesting thing. The two models for imperialism that both the United States and China exercise are very distinct and very different. Some argue that China's model is better. Some argue that America's model is better. America exercises its power through the World Bank, through the dollar, through the IMF, through finance, through investment, the private sector, through security alliances and security agreements and multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. That is how the United States exercises its power. China, on the other hand, exercises its power geopolitically by building infrastructural projects as well as supplying services, critical services, and technological services at a discount price that the United States and its private firms won't do business at. So it's a critical distinction how each country operates and exerts influence onto others. Now, here's the thing. Besides the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's infrastructure project that's going to span all of Asia and potentially even into parts of Africa, what they're attempting to do with the Belt and Road Initiative is build ports, build railways, high-speed rail, build trade corridors, land routes, where they can increase and improve efficiency, shipping. It can be profitable. They can integrate supply chains in a way that allows them to have more control and more leverage because they will control the infrastructure that is going to be laid down in these various countries. But on top of that, there is a digital Silk Road that China is currently pouring billions of dollars into that isn't getting a lot of attention. Now, what is the digital Silk Road? Well, basically what it is it's kind of a digital technological offshoot or spin-off of the Belt and Road Initiative. They're building servers. They're building data centers. They're building fiber optic cables that span across multiple countries, that go to multiple countries. They're controlling much of that critical infrastructure. They're controlling the landing stations and the data centers. They're building cloud zones in Argentina and in Mexico and in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey and in Kenya and in South Africa and various other countries. They're expanding telecommunications in all of these countries as well. And this is one of the biggest threats of our lifetime. Understand that. Because with all this infrastructure, with all this digital infrastructure that's being built, it gives them access on what information can be viewed, on the speed at which transactions can be processed. They can view and extract information from the servers in these various countries where business is being conducted. And it's going to give them the ability to exert a massive amount of control and leverage over countries without even needing to put a foot on the ground, with no military whatsoever. And this is one of the biggest concerns in regards to the situation with Taiwan. If you guys don't know by now, I'm sure many of you do, but if you don't know by now, the situation with Taiwan is incredibly important. Taiwan is the biggest producer of semiconductor chips on the globe. They control 50% of the global foundry market, 68% of the global market share, just the share of chips in the global market come from Taiwan, and they control 90% of the global production in the most advanced semiconductors, 2 nanometers, 3 nanometers, 4 nanometers, which are incredibly small chips, about the width of an atom. Or at least the circuitry or pieces on these chips are about the width of an atom, one of the two. So they are leading by a wide margin in semiconductor production, in research and development, in the foundry and fabrication of these semiconductor chips. They are by far and away ahead of every other country on Earth, including China, including the United States, although we're beginning to close that gap, fortunately. And so that's the big concern here. If China invades Taiwan and takes over their biggest foundry, TSMC, that would effectively give China a monopoly on the semiconductor business, which is incredibly important because, as I'm sure many of you already know, semiconductors are used for everything. The camera I'm using right now has a semiconductor in it. The laptop in front of me has a semiconductor in it. My phone has semiconductors. Smartwatches, smart refrigerators, cars, planes, tanks, fighter jets, all that stuff has semiconductors inside of it because they use transistors and they use other materials and other circuitry that exists inside it to move, to circuit the electricity throughout the device so that it can operate, so that it can function. The window in your car, the electronics in your car have semiconductors. The car handle on Teslas have semiconductors. Everything that is electronic, that isn't manual, in most cases has a semiconductor. And so effectively, if China assumes or seizes control of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, that would give them total and complete control over the most important stage or the most important phase in the global supply chain for semiconductor manufacturing or for semiconductor production, which is the manufacturing phase. That's the midstream phase. Because with semiconductor production, there's multiple phases. You have upstream, which is actually getting the silicon, putting it through a chemical process, making it electric grade silicon, and then melting it and then dipping a seed crystal into the molten silicon and taking it out and twisting it and watching it enlarge and turning it into an ingot and slicing it into wafers. That whole process, the upstream process of actually getting the silicon, melting it, producing the ingots, slicing it into wafers, that whole process, that's the upstream process. But then you have the midstream process, which is designing, the heavy machinery. But then there's the manufacturing. And this, the actual production of the semiconductor chips, you get these blueprints, you get these mask sets from Apple, from NVIDIA, from Micron, from whatever other company that specializes in microchip production, or in architecture rather, in producing these highly advanced, highly specialized, and unique mask sets that perform different functions. Some work for phones, some work for AI, some work for jets. You get the idea. They have different functions based on the circuitry that's used, the blueprint that's used to create the semiconductor. But without the actual manufacturing, you can't bring it to life. You can't bring it to the market. And so if China seizes the most important, the most critical phase, the most critical part of the supply chain, which is the actual manufacturing of these mask sets and the manufacturing of these chips, it could completely throw the entire world and the semiconductor trade off balance completely. Because the United States has not caught up to Taiwan. As I said earlier, 90% of the most advanced semiconductors, the ones that are used in new models of phones, in AI, you get the idea. The most advanced semiconductors, the most advanced chips, 90% of them are made in Taiwan. So you see how this could create a problem, because China would have the ability to leverage the production of these chips against US manufacturers, against US companies, against Apple, against NVIDIA. They could do it against European companies. They could do it against other Asian companies, Japanese companies. All of them rely on Taiwan to manufacture these chips. And so what happens if they restrict the supply? Well, the prices of phones go up, the prices of laptops go up, the prices of computers go up. And then we would have to pour billions of dollars into our own domestic microchip fab, or semiconductor fab rather. So that's kind of the biggest problem of our era. That's really the major issue that we're contending with here. And so here's the deal. In the United States, after the CHIPS Act was passed by Biden, which is probably one of the best pieces of legislation that's come out of the federal government in the past 5 years, which basically allocated upwards of $50 billion for fabrication in the United States and research and development on advanced semiconductors. Upwards of $50 billion. So what we're doing is we're trying to diversify away from Taiwan as a hedge against China potentially invading Taiwan and seizing their biggest manufacturer. And so here's the thing. Up to this point, the only manufacturers that we've really had for semiconductors in the United States has been Intel, has been Micron, Texas Instruments. Those are just the few. Those are just the few that we have here, the few that actually make the chips, that manufacture the chips. Most of them outsource it to Taiwan because it's cheaper, because they have more experience. You get the idea. But Intel and many of the companies we have here are integrated device manufacturers. They're called IDMs, which means they make the chip, but they also manufacture the chip. And that's not profitable. And the reason why is because operating a factory, operating a fab is not profitable. You have to pay maintenance. You have to pay for the plumbing. You have to pay for the staff. You have to pay for the machinery, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars. You have to actually build the factory and all the necessary machinery and equipment and electricity, lighting. You get the idea. All the wiring that's required to operate such a highly advanced and modern factory. And so many of these factories operate at a very low margin. And that's why companies like NVIDIA, companies like Apple, only specialize in actually designing these new chips, but then they outsource everything else. They outsource it to Taiwan because they have a higher profit margin that way. They don't have to pay as many expenses. I mean, a lot of these fabs, a lot of these semiconductor factories cost $20 billion to anywhere between $20 to $30 billion just to build one. Just to build one. You have to think about the upkeep and the repairs on the machinery, as well as importing and purchasing the machinery. A lot of these EUVs, these electrical ultraviolet etching machines that actually use lasers and radiation and all kinds of stuff to etch the design onto the wafer, these machines cost $300 million, $400 million. It's ridiculous. And there's only a couple countries that make them. The Netherlands is one of them. So this is kind of the dilemma that we're facing. And so that's why Biden passed the CHIPS Act. So we could pour money into this industry, into this domestic industry. We could start building factories. We could start building research and development, spending more money on research and development, on new chips, on nanometer chips, on 2 nanometer chips rather, 3 nanometer chips, 4 nanometer chips, the most advanced, the most cutting edge chips that we could possibly create. And so that's the big dilemma right now, because Intel for a long time has been losing value. Its stock has been plummeting for a long time because of historic mistakes. They didn't adapt to the AI movement. They didn't adapt to the phone, the digital phone, the cellular phone, whatever. They didn't adapt to any of those changes fast enough. And so much of their technology was outdated and thus rendered obsolete. And so now they're trying to reinvent themselves by becoming one of the biggest players in the foundry, in the fabrication, the manufacturing of these semiconductor chips. And so that's why last year, Intel received $8.5 billion in grants from the federal government, and they signed a $3 billion contract with the Pentagon for domestic projects for, using their chips for tanks and fighter jets and defense systems and whatever else. And then, of course, you have Micron, which is another American company. I believe they're stationed out of somewhere in California. So Micron is another one of these companies that's trying to move towards manufacturing, towards fabrication. They got $6.1 billion. Global Foundries, they received $1.5 billion in grants to expand their fab operations in New York and in Vermont. And then, of course, you have Texas Instruments, and they got $1.6 billion to open up new foundries in Utah and in Texas. And so here's the upside to all of this. We have massive investment, billions of dollars in investment. And we're about to get more from Japan in the coming days once the structure of this deal is fully fleshed out. And we'll talk about that soon. But this is promising. This is good. I believe this is good for a lot of reasons. I believe this is one of the best things that has happened to this country in a long time. With everything that's happened with the Epstein scandal, and I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but with the Epstein scandal, with failing on the mass deportations, with more weapons to Ukraine, more taxpayer money to Ukraine, more taxpayer money to Israel, no ceasefire. You had the Signalgate scandal. You had Mike Walls getting fired like 2 or 3 months in. He got replaced with Michael Anton because he was leaking private messages to the prime minister of Israel. You had the whole situation with Iran, bombing Iran, bringing us closer to a war when we all want a deal. I mean, God, like the whole situation, and then backing off the tariffs. I forgot to mention that, backing off the tariffs after a week when there was a lot of promise and a lot of hype. Trump comes out, 125% tariff on China, you know, 20% tariffs on every single country. You know what I mean? And there wasn't a real game plan for this because reshoring takes a long time. You got to prepare the markets. You got to prepare, you got to give the investors confidence to want to bring their money back to the United States, deploying capital, moving assets around, all that stuff takes a long time. So just throwing tariffs at everything, obviously that's risky without any kind of forethought, without any kind of long-term planning. But I still like the gesture regardless, because that's what we need. We need that here. We need manufacturing. We need an industrial base in this country, because whether you like it or not, the free market doesn't solve all of our economic problems. This is a country. This is a nation. We have interests. We have objectives as a nation to survive as a nation. And sometimes the free market does not facilitate those objectives. They aren't thinking about those objectives. They don't care about those objectives. Wall Street is concerned with their quarterly revenue, their quarterly profits. That's what they're concerned with. They're not concerned with the long-term well-being of America. If the consumer base in this country starts to shrink, if it starts to contract, they can just move and deploy their capital elsewhere, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. You get in Latin America. So we have to find a way to balance the interests between our national interests and the interests of Wall Street, because they're not the same thing, whether you like it or not. You got to understand that. Like, we are interested as a nation in having a robust industrial base, steel, aluminum, tungsten, like having those kinds of materials and using those materials to build warships, to build tanks, to build missiles, and having a domestic military industry that is robust. That is in our interest, even if the margins are slim, because it facilitates our survival as a nation, as a country. It creates jobs, even if the margins are slim. If the margins are too slim for Wall Street for a private corporation to facilitate a project like that, they're not going to do it. They're going to import materials from elsewhere, and we're going to lose jobs here. You get the idea? That's the problem. That's one of the big problems with this whole thing. And so, and just to go on it for a second here, when we look at the 2008 financial crisis, that tells all of us everything we need to know about the system that we're dealing with here. This is not a free market, and anybody who thinks this is a free market is living in a delusion. America is not a free market. It is a rigged market. It is a rigged market where banks, hedge funds, private equity firms, investors can manipulate the market through stock buybacks, through high-frequency trading, through short selling, through speculation and asset inflation, through mortgage-backed securities. They can artificially increase the demand and reduce the supply of a share, of a stock, of real estate in ways that affect the natural demand and the natural supply of housing in this country, or of stocks or of bonds or whatever. They can buy those things. They can shrink the supply when they want and then sell it back to raise the price or raise the value of a stock. And then on top of that, when you have small tech firms that want to compete with Apple, they can't do it because Apple will hit them with a lawsuit, or they'll undercut the prices. They'll take a strategic loss. so that they can operate at a loss for a temporary amount of time while selling their products for cheaper. But competitors have no means of actually competing with Apple. That's why everybody either uses a Microsoft laptop or an Apple laptop, because nobody else can compete. They are effectively a monopoly. And the reason why is because they have, like I said, they have lawsuits. They can use lawfare against you, against these smaller companies. They'll get you with some bullshit patent claim, whether it's on a GPU, a CPU, some kind of intellectual property, and say that you stole it under some weird, vague, abstract clause on intellectual property. They'll say you stole it, that it was patented. And even if the claim is nonsense, even if it's BS, the fact that you have a small company that's barely starting out having to fight all these lawsuits, I mean, they'll go bankrupt in the process. Just fighting in court, they'll go bankrupt. So you can't even really compete against these people. And to make matters worse, Apple, whenever they get their chips, their semiconductors, their critical resources, critical minerals, silicon, you get the idea, lithium batteries, they have not a monopoly, but they have a way of, like a way of controlling the lever of what supplier in Japan, what supplier in Asia, wherever else will give them the critical resources that they need to actually build their technology, to actually build the batteries that they put inside the iPhone. They have ways of manipulating that. They have contracts, and they can slide these contracts over to the suppliers and say, look, we'll give you X amount of money, X amount of the profit, 20, 30%, whatever. But we get to buy 90% of your supply, and the other 10% can only go to companies that are not our competitors, which effectively locks out any startup company from access to critical minerals in the supply chain. So this is the kind of rigging of the economy that these various corporations, these various companies engage in. We don't live in a free market. And we know we don't live in a free market because in a free market, when a company fails, they die. When a company fails, they die. But then you have zombie companies like Delta, like United Airlines, like Hertz, and Wall Street will just come in, buy up the stock, pump up the stock, inflate it, resuscitate these companies, and make a shit ton of money excuse me for my swearing, make a load of money in the process after these stocks start to increase in value. And then just to go on for a second here, I mean, what are they creating? What exactly is a private equity firm or a hedge fund creating? What are they creating when they buy houses? Can somebody tell me what's being created there? When billions of dollars in high frequency trading is made every single day because they have these automated computers and these complex algorithms that immediately or automatically rather buy and sell stocks. The moment the price drops, they buy it. The moment it goes up, they sell it. When you have automated high frequency trading, I mean, the price of stocks goes up and down like crazy, and they can constantly make a profit on this. And then not to mention, they can borrow stocks. They don't even have to buy, they can borrow stocks and then short sell it. They can do a coordinated short selling where they get a bunch of other hedge funds to buy a stock or borrow a stock and then sell that stock. And then once the price goes down, buy it again and then return it to the broker and then pocket the profits after doing a coordinated selling, short selling of a stock with other hedge funds. So they can all make a profit. This is not free market capitalism. This is not what we imagined when we said we were going to get free market capitalism. When we heard we were going to get free market capitalism, what we thought was that we were going to have innovation, small businesses, free enterprise, competing, working, corresponding with each other potentially on research and development in ways that encourage both to challenge each other. But now we have lobbyists. Now we have people who are throwing BS lawsuits out there. We have people who are controlling the supply chains. I mean, this is not really a free market. If anybody thinks that, they're not really living in reality. And then please, can somebody explain to me what exactly Wall Street is doing that's benefiting me? What are they building that's helping me? Like, let's go back to 2008 for a second here. In 2008, the reason why we had this financial crisis was because the banks who were giving out mortgages were selling those mortgages to Wall Street investors and hedge funds and whatever. And those people would bundle those mortgages with other mortgages. So this bank would sell out thousands of mortgages effectively. They would sell out mortgages from Los Angeles. You'd have another bank that would sell mortgages from New York. Another bank was selling mortgages from Florida. You get the idea. And they're all selling it back to the same company, to the same hedge fund. And what they were doing with those mortgages is they were putting them all into a pool, effectively, a pool, a fund, a stock, basically. So they were merging everybody's mortgage. They were merging mortgages, 500 mortgages from LA, 500 mortgages from New York, 1,000 mortgages from Florida, 1,000 mortgages from Chicago. And they were merging all of those mortgages together. And they were paying back the banks that were selling those mortgages to them with a lump sum. And then they would merge those mortgages together, and it would be like a stock. And then there would be investors who would buy pieces of that combined mortgage. It's called a mortgage-backed security. And a mortgage-backed security is just thousands of individual mortgages merged together into one security, into one stock effectively. And you'd have different people, different investors, different hedge funds that would buy a piece, that would buy a slice, whatever, a share of that mortgage pool. And every time somebody made a monthly payment, the people who invested would make money off the interest. Some people were speculating on it. Some people were using it for derivatives. They would sign contracts with other people, and based on whether or not the value of that mortgage-backed security went up or down, they would get money off of that. They're playing around with the market in ways that none of us are profiting from. And so when the speculation for how much these houses were worth completely exceeded what they actually were worth, because people were defaulting on their homes and all the rest of it, and there was a burst in the amount of money that was owed, the amount of money that was invested in this, and watching all the value of those mortgage-backed securities and those CDOs begin to plummet. The investors panicked, the market crashed, the banks got bailed out. They were insolvent, they couldn't pay anybody back. And this is one of the primary problems with our system. This is not like a competitive system where you have free market capital fighting against other entrepreneurs and free enterprise. That's not what this is. That's not what this is. 20 to 22% of our GDP comes from financialization. It comes from banks, it comes from hedge funds, private equity, real estate, insurance, all that stuff, all these speculative and, inflating elements of our economy is responsible for 20% of the GDP. And in like the past 20 years, that number has gone up, and the amount of money that we get from production, from manufacturing, has dropped to like 8%. They've reversed effectively. So, I mean, now we're speculating on the weather at this point. People are speculating on the weather. They're speculating on wheat prices and oil prices. And when that happens, of course, oil prices go up because people start thinking there's going to be a greater demand for it. So it's all one big thing. We all, in many regards, in many cases, get hurt because of the actions of these speculators. A lot of us can't afford homes. The price of homes goes up because of this. And they're not building anything. None of the money that these hedge funds make goes back into funding profits. It doesn't go back into not funding profits, but the money that these hedge funds and private equity firms make, it doesn't go back into building infrastructure, building roads, building schools, building homes. It doesn't go into that. Building factories. That's not where that money is going. All that money is going back into the stock market. They're buying more stocks. It's going back into derivatives, into inflation. It is an extractive, it is an extractive system by nature. Because if you have somebody, and I'm sorry to explain this for so long, but it's so ridiculous. If you have somebody who has $2 million in savings to start a company, and they have two options. Option A is to actually build a business and scale it, which takes a lot of work, which takes a lot of capital, which takes a lot of time, which takes a lot of expertise. Or option B, take that $2 million, put it into a hedge fund, and let them multiply your money. What do you think is better? If you know with option A, it might not be profitable in the long term because Walmart or some other fast food chain or some other company, whatever, that is a massive competitor that has a monopoly on your industry is operating locally. I mean, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to compete with that person? Especially knowing all the other kinds of issues that might come your way, all the other obstacles that might get thrown at you. It is a hostile environment for new businesses, for innovation. And so that's why, if you're in that position, your best bet really is just to take that $2 million, give it to a hedge fund, and let them, I don't know, 2x it, 2.5x it, and then you'll make $4 million or $4.5 million on that investment. But that's the thing. It's not productive money. It's not productive. And we all kind of know this intuitively. We all know this, but that's the problem with our system as far as free market is concerned. People, all these free market, we live in a free market. America's a free market. No, it's not. It's hardly it's a rigged market with some free market aesthetics. And so that's why when we talk about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, building the real economy, real jobs, I mean, the notional value of this country, GDP, something like that, is like $600 trillion when you look at the derivative market, or the derivative market, based on anything that could possibly lose or increase value. It's like $600 trillion. And the actual GDP is like 29 trillion, 28, 29 trillion. So, I mean, look, they're not operating in reality effectively. They're not looking at the real economy and what the real value is coming from. So that's just my spiel on that. But as far as production in this country is concerned, it is of vital concern. It is like a necessity that we build things here, like a necessity that we resuscitate industry, that we pour money into industry. That is vital for this country. It is vital for jobs. It is vital for our national interests. Okay, so it is vital for research and development and competing in this digital war. We can't just outsource everything anymore. We have to be leading in something. We have to be a leader on earth in some kind of productive sector. So that's just my spiel on that. But I'll say this, because of this CHIPS Act, fortunately, our country is expected to triple its domestic production of chips by 203%, which is effective with tripling, basically. Increased by 203% by 2032. And there are infrastructure projects underway in Arizona, in Texas, billions of dollars in building fabs, in research and development, in OSATs, which is basically the people who assemble and test the semiconductors. And so that's kind of the landscape that we're looking at. Moving forward, we are moving into a point where the world really is changing in crazy ways. I really can't emphasize that enough. The world is changing in crazy ways. The digital landscape is, look, the real economy, things like wheat, food, oil, gas, coal, all that stuff is still incredibly important. It is the backbone of major economies. You need those things. Those are critical resources. But, slowly but surely there will be a transition towards cleaner energy, and there's going to be an emphasis on electricity There's going to be an emphasis on, digital technology, on AI, on how we can use, electronics and digital tools to efficiently and in a cost effective manner integrate them into more aspects of our daily life, into more technology on a day to day basis, building smart cities, things like that. And that's kind of the landscape that is developing. And moving into the future, we need to get a hold on this. This is like incredibly important. I mean, this is incredibly important. And, China, they are expanding their fiber optic networks. I mean, I said this already, but they're expanding their fiber optic networks. They're expanding their cloud servers. They are building, telecommunications networks. And the thing is, with their system, what's so crazy, and I think what's actually kind of where they have an advantage over us, is all of these companies are owned by the state. All of these Alibaba, Huawei, Chinese, the telecommunications company of China, all these corporations are owned by the state. They're all owned by the CCP. So all the revenue or a portion of the revenue, at least a portion, goes back to the CCP. And then of course they use that money for more R&D, for more production, for scaling, things like that. Whereas with our private corporations with the United States, what they do with a lot of the profits is they maximize it for, in some cases, for scaling, but a lot of it is just for the shareholders and for dividends and things like that. And so there's a lot less fixation, put it that way. There's a lot less fixation on scaling, on development, because there's other people who have their own financial interests that are muddying, that are of primary concern rather. And so that brings us to today. That brings us to where we are today. And I want to talk about this United States Japan investment deal for a second because, we didn't really get a whole lot of details on it, but I think this deal is important. And I think it's a sign of the world beginning to change a little bit because, we are entering like I said, a new realm in regards to digital advancement. No way around that. In regards to cloud computing, telecommunications, 5G networks, something maybe even faster, quantum computing, AI. These things are going to affect the future in unforeseen ways in a decade or two. And it's changing fast. We're modernizing fast. And so really getting ahead of the curve here is important. And so that's why with this investment deal with Japan, oh, and by the way, just real quick, like I was saying, we are kind of moving away from this globalized model a bit because people are starting to realize, look, 29% of the world's global supply chains, or rather the production, the goods that exist on the global market, 29% of that is from China. Like that's almost 1/3 effectively of goods on the global market that circulate throughout the world come from China. They control all of that. Their control over global supply chains is unmatched, even by the United States. And so, look, like I said, getting ahead of the curve here, it's important. And we're moving away from this kind of globalized system because we're starting to realize, if you have a country that has an advantage with the cheaper currency and cheaper cost of production, and their entire global supply chain is vertically integrated. I mean, take cobalt, for example. I mean, China controls almost 80% of the cobalt trade on Earth. Or it's like they control like 70 to 75%, or yeah, 70 to 75% roughly of the upstream, which is just the mining and extracting of cobalt, because 70 to 75% of it comes from the DRC. And China owns almost all of the mines where cobalt is dug up in the DRC, and cobalt is used for batteries, lithium batteries, EVs, all that stuff. It's a critical mineral, it's a critical resource. I think, or it's a rare earth. So not only do they control that, they control the refining of the cobalt, refining of it, making it more usable in the market. You get it. And then, of course, they also control the manufacturing of devices and the distribution of electronics that use cobalt. So, they control the entire cobalt trade effectively on Earth from beginning to end. And we can't continue to allow China to do that with every other resource. We just can't do that. We're going to be living under an economic boot, effectively, a trade boot from China if this continues to happen. And so, like I said, we are slowly but surely moving away from this kind of globalized system. And we're moving more towards bilateral trade, multilateral trade deals. And the ideal, which is, what the State Department has been talking about for a while, going back a couple years, is to get a United States, EU, Japan, Taiwan multilateral trade agreement going where we secure the supply chain between these four countries or between these, between three countries on one continent. But effectively, these four players, and we secure the supply chains, and it's backed by banks and it's guaranteed, and everybody gets their resources, even if there's a market fluctuation at a stable price. And that's kind of what we're looking towards. That's where the future is headed. We're not going to be doing this whole global supply, globalized trade. Everybody can just flood the market with cheap goods. That's not going to be a thing anymore. And so with this new trade deal with China, it's bringing a lot of promise. And I think this is a sign of things to come. And so this is the latest from Axios. If I can pull it up. Here we go. It says, or this is the latest from Reuters, rather. It says the White House said earlier this week the United States would retain 90% of the profits from the $550 billion US-bound investment and loans that Japan would make in exchange for lower tariffs on auto and other exports to the United States. The official told a briefing that resulting returns would be split 10% for Japan, 90% for the United States. And based on the respective levels of contribution and risk borne by each side, based on the respective levels of contribution and risk borne by each side. It also says here, this is from Reuters as well, says Japan's top trade negotiator, Ryosei Akazawa, said on Friday that he understands the United States is seeking a 90-10 split of returns as a sign of its commitment to shouldering a large share of the contribution and risk. Moreover, according to the Japanese government, the United States investment package includes loans and guarantees from state-owned Japan Bank for International Cooperation, the JBIC, and Nippon Export and Investment Insurance, NEXI. Says a law revision in 2023 has expanded the scope of JBIC, making foreign companies key to Japan's supply chains eligible for loans from the bank. The investment package will allow Japan to build resilient supply chains in the United States that benefit both countries in sectors key to national security, such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, steel, and shipbuilding. So, in effect, in other words, to summarize, what's basically happening here is you're going to have contracts or loans rather, and contracts as well, but loans that are going to be designated for U.S. firms that are going to make sure that there is a steady stream of pharmaceuticals, of steel, of semiconductors, and of shipbuilding materials that go to Japan. And obviously that loan is going to come with strings attached, such as, certain amount of supplies at certain prices have to be, all those conditions effectively have to be met in order for these loans to, be given out. And then on top of that, all of these loans are going to be backed by insurance, by Japan state insurance, basically. It is an insurance company that is owned by the state of Japan, the country of Japan. And so even if these companies default, this insurance company in Japan will effectively bail them out. And, like I was saying, this is a sign of things to come moving forward. We're going to start moving away from this globalized trade system, I think. But I think this is great. This is great. I think this is amazing. You know, um, the, you know, the investment, there's going to be investment, obviously, from Japanese firms in the United States, but on a broader trend, everything that's happening has kind of been positive. I mean, we've had $165 billion investment from TSMC. We're getting this massive investment from Japanese firms. They're going to spend more. And I mean, pharmaceuticals and semiconductors and steel and shipbuilding are all pretty important things, especially semiconductors. And so we can assume at least 50 to $100 billion of that pledge is going to go into semiconductors, into research and development, into foundries, fabrications, and all that kind of stuff. So we can compete on a global level. And there are some projections that are coming out saying that within the next 10 years, the global market share of semiconductors from the United States will make up about 20% of the global semiconductor trade. So I think this is promising. I think this is very promising. And like I said, it is going to be important in the future to be able to diversify away from TSMC. And I mean, we've already been hedging against it. We've already been hedging against it by pouring all this money into our domestic semiconductor industry. Because, like I said, there's a possibility that Taiwan gets raided by China in the next couple years. So we'll see how that plays out. But this is good. This is obviously very good for obvious reasons. But anyways, so that's the episode for today. That's all I have to say about that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to be talking a lot more about this in the coming weeks, by the way. We're going to see how a lot of this unfolds and develops, because the importance of this is not something that can really be understated. This is important. And we can't get left behind on this, because these devices, these semiconductors they're invaluable. So that's my take on the whole situation. But we'll see how this unfolds in the future. We will see what new trade deals emerge in the coming weeks. There will be a lot more to talk about. So anyways, that's the video. If you guys liked it, please like, please subscribe, please share, please comment. And until further ado, I'm out.